The Dissolution of the Monasteries, 1535, 1540. This was carried out by the second Tudor king, the dynamic, and as the saying goes, controversial Henry VIII, after his break with Rome, ably assisted by his minister, Thomas Cromwell, not, by the way, to be confused with his more famous collateral descendant, Oliver Cromwell, who flourished over 100 years later. The dissolution of the monasteries meant a drastic, brutal break with nearly 1,000 years of British history. They were dissolved in both England and Wales. There had been monasteries in England since about 600 AD, monasteries in Wales for longer than that. So monasteries had been around long before there ever was a Kingdom of England. But Henry VIII gets rid of them, dissolves them, winds them all up in 4 years. First of all, we must ask why. Well, the official reasons are a load of rubbish, really. In 1535, Henry sends round corrupt investigators, commissioners, to investigate the morals and general standards of behaviour of the monasteries. And they come back with a really sensational picture which makes ripping reading the sort of thing that people today like to read on Sundays. That monks and nuns are up to all sorts of tricks, heterosexual and homosexual debauchery, drinking all the time, totally idle, and sometimes very corrupt. Now, there were a few cases like this, which you might expect. Many monks and nuns took their vows of celibacy before they knew what they were doing, particularly as puberty was later in those days, and then they found they'd given up the chance of a romantic or sex life, and they reneged on it. But this wasn't that common. Even homosexuality, when you get people of the same gender together, rather enclosed, you're liable to get some of that. But in fact, it wasn't that common. Drinking, well, everyone did quite a bit of drinking in those days. So after all, beer and wine were healthier to drink than the water, very often. There were also cases of criminality, agreed. For example, at the time of the commissioners were going around, the abbot of Whitland Abbey in Carmarthenshire in Wales was wanted for highway robbery in Oxfordshire. And another monk of Whitland was in jail in Carmarthen because he'd been forging coins in his official cell, his monastic cell in Whitland. But, again, this wasn't so usual. Monks and nuns had probably lost their fervour. They weren't sticking to their austere regime, which most of their orders had laid down, of manual labour. They weren't praying for their own souls and for the souls of the laity enough. One of their main functions, that of producing illuminated manuscripts, one of the great glories of the English Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, had been taken away by the advent of printing. So, although they were there, what, in a way, were they good for? They were probably the elite. The abbots and priors and prioresses were drawn from the country gentry and seemed to be woven very naturally into local gentry society. They dined in the manor houses, entertained their lay equivalents, who were often their relatives anyway. They employed country gentry as stewards. They were involved in the endless law suits of the period over land and woods, which was over the property of the monastery. So they were much the same as their social equivalents, and ordinary monks and nuns were probably much the same as ordinary country people in their outlook and morals. But that's not good enough. The whole point about monks and nuns is they should be better than, according to Catholic teaching, than ordinary people, sort of spiritual Olympic athletes, if you like. The monasteries, many of them, there were poor houses, particularly the nunneries, but the main monasteries were very wealthy. They'd accumulated wealth over hundreds of years. So you could say that you had a semi-useless body of people not using the vast resources which they had. That's a rather 20th century term. But that's not really the way that Henry depicted them. He needed much better excuses. So this sensational picture of debauchery was believed for hundreds of years because Protestants wanted to believe it, but it's not true. But Henry's real motive I've already hinted at. He wanted their wealth. He was in debt, and he wanted the wealth of the monasteries, which might have come to almost a third of the total wealth of England. Henry, although he broke with Rome, was not really a Protestant. He was his own sort of Catholic. He believed in the Catholic Church with himself as Pope, really. His chief minister, the man who did all the hard work of taking over the monasteries, Thomas Cromwell, however, although he had to tread carefully, served the king's notion of grabbing the wealth of the monasteries, but Cromwell was also a secret Lutheran. So with Thomas Cromwell there was an ideological motive for dissolution, because according to Lutheran teaching you didn't need monasteries. Luther himself was an ex-monk who gave up being a monk. There was no purgatory, the Protestants taught, and monasteries prayed for the souls of people in purgatory. The Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was also half Lutheran. So there were powerful Protestant forces round Henry. Anyway, the monasteries were dissolved in 2 bites. In 1536, all the smaller monasteries, those who were under, in income, 200 a year, on the grounds that they were the most immoral, whereas the bigger monasteries, thanks be to God, true religion is right well kept and observed. Rather odd that it's observed if you've got more than £200 a year, not otherwise. In fact, it's because the king, A, couldn't absorb all the monasteries at once. It was too much of an administrative task. B, he didn't know how attached people were to the monastic ideal, and he wanted to give people hope it was going on if some monasteries remained. Because he didn't want a general revolt on his hands. In fact, he got one anyway. The Pilgrimage of Grace, 40% of England, the north, from the Scottish border down to Lincolnshire, revolted against the dissolution, among other grievances, and it was very dangerous in 1536. It could have toppled the monarchy, but Henry and his ministers got on top of it, and that was the great revulsion against Henry's dissolution. It's often been discounted, this dissolution, by historians, because most British historians since have had a subtle or unsubtle Protestant bias, be it happens up north, and most British historians tended to have a London, or southern rather, view of things, and what happens in northern England is not terribly important. That is a bias which has needed to be corrected. But anyway, Henry got over that, and he went slow on dissolving the rest, but he dissolved them nevertheless in 1539, 1540. The last monastery to be dissolved was Christ Church, Canterbury, attached to the cathedral in 1540. What were the results? Well, first of all, immense spoils for the king in land, treasure, and sheer money, coins. This had a trickle-down effect. Some of it was deliberately sold or granted to bind people of Catholic persuasion to the new settlement. The Duke of Norfolk, who put down the Pilgrimage of Grace, was nevertheless a good Catholic, but to make sure he didn't revert to being a Roman Catholic, he was endowed with the monastic lands. A nobleman of Protestant inclination were as well, like the ancestor of the great Russell family. John Russell, first Earl of Bedford, not Earl of Bedford yet, was given monastic lands, Woburn Abbey, which his family still have, in Bedfordshire, and monastic lands in the West Country. But many monastic lands were sold, and anyone who had money could buy them. This led to a certain social rise. Yeomen and merchants with money could become gentry if they doubled their acreage. Small gentry could become bigger gentry could qualify for peerage status. People around the king, not just the obvious courtiers, but the king's cook and the king's barber, bought a lot of lands at favourable rates and set up as gentry. So there was a big rise like that. It's probably from this time that we date the rise of the gentry as the identifiable class, which lasts into the early 20th century. The squire ceases to be dependent on the local great earl, and becomes a rather independent little king of the local countryside. The market in land, in fact, remains volatile, and there's plenty of land to buy until about 1660 for various reasons. If the monarchy had held on to all this land, it would probably have been semi-absolute, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of patronage. If it had held on to monastic estates, the gentry as previously would have to have been its employees as stewards, as they'd been employees of the abbots. But as it happens, they were allowed to buy the estates which they previously managed, a management buyout, you might say. As has happened writing their own rules in the Soviet lands more recently. Also patronage of live-ins. The monasteries nominated priests to various parish live-ins. This often passed when land was sold by the king to the local gentry. So the king, although officially he had great control of the church, in fact at parish pump level passed it often to the local squire, which was short-sighted. But anyway, it was partly because Cromwell fell, the king executed him, not being very grateful in 1540, and then the king started to dissipate his lands. On the cultural level, the dissolution was a disaster. The buildings were left to decay. Let's look at three great abbeys in the Thames Valley: Reading, Abingdon, Osney. Go to Reading, you'll see a few stones. Go to Osney near Oxford Rail Station, you'll just about see a barn which survives from those days. Abingdon, slightly more, is surviving, but nothing like the 7 acres of buildings which were there originally. So it was an architectural disaster. Most of the buildings decayed. The abbeys were gutted and sold off. So crucifixes, all sorts of works of art went, carved wood. Even worse, medieval illuminated manuscripts were either sold for a song or recycled to be used for putting your washing bill on or your local accounts on. And some of them were recovered, but a lot of these libraries of the Middle Ages gone forever. It meant the church much smaller. A whole great limb of the church was just cut off and has never been there since. It was all done on the Lutheran model in Saxony of 10 years earlier, and it was a powerful negative blow in the Protestant direction, as Cromwell recognised. The king didn't proclaim it as a Protestant policy, but monasticism is associated with the Catholic Church, and now monasticism has gone. The church becomes smaller, shown at the elite level in the fact that the bishops and mitred abbots, i.e. equivalent to bishops, were a majority in the House of Lords until the dissolution. Now there are only 26 bishops left, and they became an ever smaller minority as the number of lay peers grew. It's something which has never been reversed. The Pilgrims of the North were defeated. Queen Mary had no time, in the Catholic reaction in the 1550s, to found the monasteries. Since the 1850s, the Roman Catholics have been allowed to have monasteries in this country, and even the Anglicans have sometimes, high Anglicans have sometimes imitated them. But it's not really the same thing. It's a marginal interest.